Who is the bad guy in history who isn't actually a bad guy? Story 1. Charles Lightoller, most senior officer who survived the Titanic disaster. He gets mostly remembered for interpreting Captain Smith's order to evacuate as women and children only, leading to the deaths of most of the male passengers. He even got dealt a tie hand in the James Cameron Titanic, with one scene having him threaten to shoot the passengers like dogs if they didn't order themselves, an event which did not happen. But after the disaster, he gave a very honest testimony and did not shy away from being to blame. He was the one who stood up in court and said we were reckless to keep the ship at speed on a calm sea where icebergs would be difficult to see. He later campaigned with the British Board of Trade and other maritime organizations to create new mandatory regulations, basing lifeboat capacity on the number of passengers and crew instead of ship tonnage, conducting lifeboat drills so passengers know where their lifeboats are and crew know how to operate them, instituting manned 24-hour wireless radio communications on all passenger ships, and requiring mandatory transmissions of ice warnings to ships, regulations which are still followed today. In May 1940, he heard about the evacuation at Dunkirk on the radio and jumped in his personal yacht, the Sundowner, and saved 127 men. He was a remarkable man. What do you think about this story? Write your opinion in the comments. Peter Lustig, a popular German kids' TV presenter whose legacy got torn down by Bild, Germany's biggest tabloid paper, because he refused to collaborate with them. They made up stuff about him, of how he kids, etc., and spread the news so far and wide that the correction, they were sued and forced to write a clarification, has not reached out to everyone yet. So many people to this day still believe the accusation, even after his death, and it's a shame Bild ruined his last years and never really got punished for it. Story 3. Anne Boleyn. Anne tried to leave court when Henry VIII took an interest in her. It was a position her family had worked hard to secure, and one she had trained for. Yet she retreated to Hever Castle to escape his interest. Surviving letters from King Henry VIII show that he continued to write to her after she had left, wondering why she was refusing his gifts and not sending responses. He would stay nearby at her cousin's estates and ignore her polite refusals. Eventually he traveled to Hever with an offer of marriage. She agreed to marry Henry and was reviled for it. Her contemporaries attempted to paint her as a vile, opportunistic seductress who enthralled the king. In reality, she was relentlessly sexually harassed. It's possible she kept those letters to prove she had done nothing wrong. What a lot of people tend to forget is that Anne was deeply pious. It is likely that she learned to accept her fate, as it provided her with the influence to make the kind of reforms she believed in. And indeed, it's possible that she played a significant role in Henrician Reformation. Anne famously became one of the 2 wives that Henry VIII executed. A promising new alliance fell apart when Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire refused to ratify their marriage. She also had a falling out with her closest ally at court, Thomas Cromwell. Henry was already smitten with Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. And most damning of all, Anne had failed to produce a male heir. Historians generally agree that the evidence of Anne's adultery was likely fabricated by Henry as an excuse to be rid of her. They pretty much unanimously agree that the accusation that she had an affair with her own brother is entirely made up, despite it costing George Boleyn his life. He gave an impassioned speech at his execution stating, "Trust not in the vanity of the world, and especially in the flattering of the court." Henry made sure Anne had a terrible time locked in the Tower of London, where it's reported she had a restless night before her execution. He left her body lying in the square for some time as proper burial arrangements had not been made, and in his lingering resentment, he tried to erase her from history and court. She became a maligned woman of Tudor history, one who still fascinates popular culture today, but only when played as a scheming seductress. She is perhaps one of the longest examples of slut-shaming through history, a victim of sexual harassment, a pious and devout woman who vowed to be no man's mistress, not even a king's. For the crime of not bearing a male heir, she died and lives on as a media mockery of her true self. Her last laugh is that the undesired girl she gave birth to went on to become one of England's greatest queens. Queen Elizabeth of Henry brutalized his wives in his obsession for a male heir and became surpassed by a woman instead. I like to think this was a little bit of karma for Anne. Story 4. Frederick II. He's also known as the spawn of the devil. So obviously people don't think highly of him, but he was actually a pretty decent leader to his people. It's just either the current pope of that time didn't like him and spread rumors about him, which eventually led to him getting that nickname, or just wanted the land he owned. Story 5. Draco, the author of the first Athenian legal code. The word draconian implying unduly harsh or punitive, derives from the historical reputation of the legal code he wrote, basically having death be the sole option for most criminal infractions. But at the time he was writing, Athenian society really only had death, exile, or shunning as viable punishments. He was exiled from Athens for the backlash to the work he was commissioned to perform by the Athenian assembly. What do you think about this story? Write your opinion in the comments. Story 6 in the film Titanic, the character Murdoch killed someone, took bribes, and generally came across as a right. He was a real-life person who was actually a hero and saved many lives. His living relatives were so disgusted that the VP of Fox traveled to Dalbeattie to personally apologize and presented a £5,000 donation to Dalbeattie High School to boost the school's William Murdoch Memorial Prize. Story 7. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line and the antagonist in James Cameron's Titanic. He was the gentleman who said that people wanted to marvel at the speed of Titanic and prodded Captain Smith to sail faster. In all actuality, Ismay wouldn't have had much, if any, input to Smith, and if so, Smith likely wouldn't have heeded Ismay's advice, as Smith was nearing retirement and would not have taken advice from a businessman. Alternatively, Ismay knew that he was in capable hands and would never impose upon the captain by telling him how to sail his ship. Survivors testified that during the sinking, Ismay was trying everything he could to assist with the filling of the lifeboats. He convinced passengers to get into boats, and at one point had to be told by an officer to stop trying to help as he was getting in the way. Ismay took a vacant seat on one lifeboat just before it was about to be lowered, which was one of many empty spots on that particular lifeboat. Ismay was a scapegoat because he was the highest-ranking survivor of the sinking, and he became a recluse afterwards. As another testament to his character, he created several charities aimed at helping families and survivors of maritime incidents. This is the comment of You Mighty Casey Struck Out. Great comment. Story 8. Alfred Nobel. People assume he invented dynamite so it could be used as a weapon and blame him for all the millions of war deaths since, and say it's ironic that he created the Nobel Peace Prize. He was from a family of miners, and his father and elder brother both died in gunpowder accidents, so he wanted to create a safe explosive they wouldn't go off if you accidentally dropped it. He was literally trying to save lives. Story 9. Machiavelli. He's reviled for the prince for basically pushing what everyone at the time privately practiced for the sake of taking advantage of a specific opportunity that arose in Italy. His discourses are far more fleshed out, far closer a reflection of him, and contextualize much of the prince such that I genuinely not recommend reading the prince without the discourses. Story 10. Monica Lewinsky literally broke away from federal agents who were trying to get her on the record against Bill Clinton. She snuck away and tried to call Clinton's secretary Betty Curry. Curry was at lunch and missed the call. The feds eventually got a statement from Monica. Clinton didn't know, and Clinton lied to feds. Had Monica reached Curry, the world would be a completely different place. Story 11. Marie Antoinette was most likely just an overly sheltered rich woman who was used as a pawn in a political marriage, then ridiculed when asked about topics she had no real knowledge on or power to change. Not saying she was a good person, but we don't know what she would have done if she wasn't sheltered from the suffering of her people or had married for love instead of familial obligations. Story 12. Vlad the Impaler gets a bad rap. He's well known for impaling people on spikes, but he did this mostly to prisoners who were already dead. He did it to scare the Ottoman Empire from invading his land, so he placed impaled bodies by the road the Ottomans were coming down to frighten them out of attacking his land. It worked, and the Romanians stayed free instead of becoming another colony of the empire. He's a hero in Romania, but we just think of him and see him as evil. He was just clever. Story 13. Courtney Love. There are absolutely a lot of valid reasons to dislike her. I love her music, but some of her actions and the things she says vary from absolutely wild to indefensible. But I don't believe for a second she killed Kurt Cobain or orchestrated it. And the amount of just vitriolic misogyny she gets thrown at her is huge and constant. Their daughter even catches residual off of this and has horrible things said about her. Kurt Cobain was a huge feminist, and I think he'd be beyond disgusted at the things being said by people claiming to be Nirvana fans. ETA. There's also the thing about publicly outing Harvey Weinstein. On the red carpet of the roast of Pamela Anderson, coked out of her mind, Courtney said the best advice she could give to young women in Hollywood: "I'll get libeled if I say it. If Harvey Weinstein invites you to a private party at the Four Seasons, don't go." Absolutely destroyed her acting career. She was on a lot of drugs at the time, but hey, gooding advice. Story 14. It's commonly, though, Saigon execution by Eddie Adams in 1968 reflected a cold-blooded murder of a youth in the street, but that's not the case. The first thing to know about General Lone, seen shooting the gun, is that he was absurdly good at his job. Universally adored by his men, he had led combat operations against the North, both on land and as a pilot, and he had risen to the rank of brigadier general on merit, rather than by the nepotism common in the Saigon government. Many times Lone had intervened to restrict the violence of American combat operations in the Mekong Delta, and he was among the strongest voices in Saigon for asserting South Vietnam's sovereignty in its dealings with the United States. On the morning of the Saigon execution photo, Nguyen Van Lem's, man being shot's death squad, had just killed 34 people, 7 police officers, 2 or 3 Americans, and several police officers' family members, all bound at the wrists and shot in the head over a pit, and they may have been looking for Lone himself. Legally, this put Lem in a bad position. He wasn't wearing a uniform, he wasn't fighting a battle, and he had evidently committed a major war crime against General Lone's own subordinates and their kids. As a war criminal and terrorist, Lem had effectively no protection under the Geneva Conventions and was eligible for summary execution when caught. Eddie Adams' Saigon execution photo made its way into countless papers around the world, stripped of context and presented as a war crime caught on film. Without knowing who the victim was or why he was shot, the public was left to assume that he was just a random civilian being murdered by a bloodthirsty sadist. Story 15. The Luddites that destroyed industrial equipment in England at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution had good intentions and were folk heroes. But now the term Luddite is used as a pejorative term for a person who resists new technology coming out, with the connotation that they are stubborn and unreasonable. Luddites in history were actually the good guys trying to ensure laborers had a better quality of life. They only hurt the equipment of the factory bosses who treated their workers poorly. Story 16. Neville Chamberlain was Prime Minister of the UK in the 1930s and was widely blamed for letting the Nazis rise to power as his peace talks with Hitler led to the Germans practically going unopposed until they invaded Poland and started World War II. 30 years later, it emerged that Chamberlain knew the Germans were up to no good, but that raising the issue was going to guarantee that World War II would have started in 1936 instead of 1939, and that the UK was not prepared for another war after the last one. Those last 3 years were spent preparing for an inevitable war that was guaranteed, and the prep time was necessary for the Allies winning the war later. Story 17. I just think Medusa, which is often seen as a villain, but her story is one of victimization and injustice, reflecting the consequences of trauma and the complexities of power dynamics, and because of that, the curse turned her into a monster with snakes for hair, causing anyone who looked at her to turn to stone. Story 18. Not sure if he is seen as a bad guy because of what he achieved, but many people believe Ernest Shackleton foolishly led an Antarctic expedition that ended up in dire peril. Everyone was saved, including the ship's cat, through a series of adventures almost too impossible to believe. The truth is that Shackleton was asked to lead the expedition, but he refused. He said it was the wrong time of year for the voyage and that it would end in disaster. The British Admiralty was so eager for the expedition to go ahead, they sent a different boat and crew. When word reached Shackleton at his country home, he immediately set off on a rescue mission, needlessly putting his own life and that of his crew at risk. Those unfamiliar with the rest of the story should investigate. It is possibly the greatest story of survival in the most adverse of conditions in recorded history. Story 19. I'm here to say this. Almost the entire Black Panther Party. The group was started to save lives, stand up for the downtrodden, regardless of race, creed, or socioeconomic status, and the straight-up got vilified as a terrorist group based on racist ideology and Hoover's hard-on. They were largely ignored until they started making serious traction with non-black groups through solidarity. Then they became a serious threat. I mean, the reason why we have free lunch today in schools for everyone regardless of race was because they instituted it on the strength that nobody should go hungry. The government was against it until they saw the value, monetarily and politically, then stole the idea for their own. Gun control wasn't even a thing until they started showing up policing the police, and the courts didn't even really shoot anybody, just made a show about how they ain't standing for it no more. Please don't bring up fringe in comparison. Bottom line is their work was never done, but they were in an era that wasn't ready for their work. Hence, why we are still in a place where standing for the national anthem holds more weight than standing up against police brutality. Story 20. Napoleon is widely seen as a madman and egomaniac, but when you follow his career into detail, he wasn't an evil tyrant like Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin that came later. He was a victim of propaganda in a Europe that was still mostly ruled by monarchs who manipulated the press in their countries to paint him as a Watt-mongering madman. Sure, he wasn't perfect, but his government structures made tons of sense, and most of the things he set up in France are still there. Story 21, Doubting Thomas. The disciple of Jesus who couldn't wrap his head around the idea that his homeboy was alive after being crucified. When like 4 days beforehand, when his boy JC was about to get crossed out for good, Tommy Boy uttered the most loving, heroic baller line of all time. Let us also go that we may die with him. Thomas was a real one, and yet we use Doubting Thomas as a in slur. Tommy was in Ride or Die for J Nazi, 10/10. Story 22, Captain Bligh. His punishment and discipline is harsh by modern standards, but quite mild by contemporary standards, if not lenient. Offenses aboard that he punished with lashes could well have been punishable by death in the late 1700s. Also, he performed one of the greatest feats of navigation in history, and in the process was able to keep every one of his crew alive by the time they reached East Timor, over a month after being put off the Bounty, after navigating over 3,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean by memory. He learned well from his mentor, Captain Cook. Story 23, Gorbachev. Answer: it's because of Gorbachev that everyone born after the mid-80s didn't grow up doing regular duck-and-cover drills to prepare for a nuclear war. Baby boomers and Gen X just had to live their lives knowing that there was a non-zero chance that today would be the day they looked up and saw a mushroom cloud on the horizon. There were two paths Gorbachev could have taken given the Soviet economic crisis in the 80s. Neither were good, but the one with less economic freedom and more repression would have taken the USSR back to the days of Stalin, or worse. It would be the only way to hold it all together, and it would have taken an absolute lunatic hardliner to carry on with policies that had so obviously failed. And he would have had 10,000 nuclear warheads at this disposal. The entire world would have sat waiting, holding their breath, for the moment something set him off. I, you, and everyone else under 40 grew up in peace thanks to Gorbachev. We may have managed to screw it up in other ways, but we owe him a debt of gratitude for that. Story 24. Gaddafi kinda. Free healthcare, free electricity, interest-free loans. Newlyweds receive $50,000 to find a home. Mother receives $5,000 each childbirth. All citizens receive a percentage of all oil exports from the country. Gas was 0.14 per liter. Free education. No Rothschild central bank. Home considered human right. He got invaded because he tried to nationalize oil. It's comical because he was pro-U.S. military-industrial complex / was actively in the works of buying military equipment from the U.S. What would you do in such a situation? Write in the comments. Story 25. Gotta get ready for the I'll get for this, but I gotta say it. Fidel Castro. He's one of the best leaders Latin America has ever seen, and the reason he's portrayed as a bad guy is not because he was actually a monster, but because of a 60-year character assassination campaign by the U.S. and Cuban exiles. Sure, he did things any of us could disagree with, but so did Barack Obama. In fact, Barack Obama has more blood in his hands than Castro does. He's responsible for Cuba having had some of the lowest poverty levels in Latin America until recently, along with an amazing healthcare and education system. Most of the problems Cuba has today are not the result of the Castro regime, but rather the result of crushing sanctions embargoes that have been imposed on the island and would have crushed any economy. Story 26, I'd say Aaron Burr. Sure, he killed Hamilton in a duel, but a lot of people forget that Burr fought for the little guy by supporting the abolition of the requirement that one must own property to vote, supported freedom of the press, supported women's rights, and advocated on behalf of immigrants, while Hamilton's Federalist Party supported laws that made anyone that was non-Anglo second-class citizens and even attempted to ban non-Anglos from holding office. Story 27, the Vikings. Long story short, Vikings were big into personal hygiene for their time and bathed and combed regularly. When they made landfall in England, the English women were impressed by their clean, non-smelly bodies compared to the local Englishmen. The Englishmen took note of this and began calling them heathens, made all sorts of stories about raping and pillaging to scare the ladies away from the beautiful Scandinavian boatmen. Story 28. I can think of 3 people, and they are the West Memphis 3. The 3 then teenagers were wonderfully convicted of murdering 3 kids in West Memphis, with the supposed leader, Damien Echoes, being sentenced to death. They were offered an offered plea to allow them to go free on time served while allowing the WM3 to claim their innocence. Story 29. Vald the Impaler. This guy was the reason the Ottomans didn't fully invade Eastern Europe and had to amend their entire invasion plans. Vald, in 1459, Vald stopped paying blood tribute, which had been put in place by the Pope. So when the Ottomans invaded Romania, Vald's forces were outnumbered 4-1 with zero help from the Vatican. He terrified the Ottomans so badly that they thought he was a literal demon from hell. When the Ottomans were invading, he filled the surrounding forests with pit traps and hanged the bodies of kidnapped scouts. At a certain point, Vald burned a large portion of the forests, so the further the Ottomans came inland, the less they had to use. Also, by that point, their supply lines were stretched, as Vald's scouts had been raiding supply lines randomly. When the Ottomans reached Vald, the countryside and the road was lined by still living, piked Ottoman soldiers. When the Ottoman general met with Vald to talk terms, the hill was decked out in white linen. Vald himself, the tablecloth and the carpet. The food was all cooked rare and the wine was blood red. The still living piked soldiers bled onto everything, and it made an immediate impact. To add to this, blood sprayed onto Vald's food, wine. Seeing this, he continued to eat and drink with said blood on it. This horrified the Ottoman general and those with him. From that point on, Vald was seen a terrifying individual to the Ottomans, an actual real-life monster. At the next battle, Vald was successful in stopping another invasion force, numbering around 20,000 soldiers. The Ottomans had to change their entire invasion plans and went primarily after him. To many, Vald's the reason Eastern Europe was speaking Arabic centuries before they came back en masse. Story 30. Hetty Green was an American businesswoman and financier known as the richest woman in America during the Gilded Age and Queen of Wall Street. She was and gossiped by so many men within financial industry. She had superior discipline, never wasted money, lived modestly. She made a lot of smart investment moves and actually rescued a lot of business during the market crash of 1929 because she was lending her money at a reasonable interest and didn't take advantage of the already misfortunate businesses. People were so jealous of her wealth that they would spread rumors that she has been wearing the same pair of underwear for years and chose not to treat her son's medical condition. She did. She was a silent philanthropist saying that she believes in discreet charity. Extraordinary woman. D for her success, discipline, and smart choices. The whole male Wall Street's ego couldn't bear the fact that a woman can be so successful. This is what she once said to journalists. It has turned out that my life is written for me down in Wall Street by people who I assume do not care to know one iota of the real Hetty Green. I am in earnest. Therefore, they picture as heartless. I go my own way, take no partners, risk nobody else's fortune. Therefore, I am Madame Ishmael, set against every man. Story 31. Benedict Arnold. He did turn traitor. Totally not cool. I think he was driven to it after repeatedly being denied opportunities to help the revolutionary cause. I don't remember all the details of all the times he was passed over for opportunities to contribute, but I think if he had been allowed to contribute in a more meaningful way earlier, he would probably be considered a founding father today. Story 32. Neville Chamberlain. Peace in our lifetime was far less the result of naivety and mostly realpolitik. England's military forces were woefully under-equipped, and a Battle of Britain at the time would have a very uncertain outcome. He knew the treaty looked bad, but England needed the time to build up its air force. The people that vilified him were the same ones voting down his rearmament proposals in 1935, claiming it was baseless fear-mongering and a waste of money. Story 33. Neville Chamberlain. Prime Minister of Great Britain from May 1937 until May 1940, when he resigned during World War II. Unfairly labeled an appeasement monkey when he signed the Munich Agreement with Adolf Hitler in September 1938, which ceded control of the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany. He's been and mocked ever since. The reality was that he knew in 1937 that war with Germany was coming no matter what. But Britain was absolutely not prepared and would have lost any war with Germany. So he undertook the biggest peacetime rearmament the world had ever seen. In 1938, when he signed the Munich Agreement, Britain was not ready for war, so he needed time. And so he had no choice but to sign the Munich Agreement. Unfortunately for him, there was this guy named Winston Churchill, who was a direct descendant of the Duke of Marlborough, who thought that it was his God-given destiny to be prime minister and to lead the nation in an existential struggle for its very survival. Churchill pulled every dirty trick in the book of political tricks to unseat Chamberlain. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, which made Chamberlain look like a chump. Churchill used that as a tool to further his own political aspirations. But Chamberlain knew that he had no choice. War against Germany had arrived whether Britain was prepared or not. Britain and a very reluctant France declared war on Germany. The British dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India also soon joined the fight. But the USA stayed out for another 2 years, and Churchill never ceased in his mocking of Chamberlain in order for him to get what he wanted. But the fact of the matter was that without Chamberlain's determination, Britain quite likely would have been conquered. Without Chamberlain, there would have never been squadrons of Spitfires or Hurricanes or radar, or a modernized navy, or a revitalized army, or the system of coastal defense. Sadly, he died in November of 1940, a broken man who had heard every bit of the derision against him. Ironically, when some British parliamentarians made jokes about him in death, in perhaps some sort of sense of guilt for what he had said and done, it was Winston who spoke in his defense. Story 34. Albert Blythe. He was a private first class of Easy Company. He was shown to be a coward in HBO's Band of Brothers. On screen, he was shown to be shot and killed by a sniper fire as a story arc. It was mostly due to the other members of Easy Company never knew what happened to him after his injury. He went home and lived his life until the Korean War, where he fought and received the Bronze Star and Silver Star. Eventually, he lived his life in the military until his death in 1967 from a perforated ulcer. What would you do? I'm waiting in the comments. Story 35. The Persians in antiquity, especially when compared to the freedom-loving mainland Greeks. Not only were the Persian subjects much more egalitarian and progressive than the mainland Greeks, they only invaded mainland Greece because Athens was meddling in Anatolia and sponsoring revolts. The same when looking at later periods, Sasanian Persians versus Romans, for example. Story 36, General Manuel Noriega. During Operation Just Cause, the U.S. government invaded Panama and installed a democratic government akin to our own. Ousting their dictator, we used illegal means and measures, questionable tactics, and arguably committed some of the most heinous war crimes in our nation's history, trialing some untested military equipment. I won't go into detail further than that about the war crimes, but the information is out there if you so choose to find it. How is he a good guy? Well, even the U.S. government thought he was a good guy. Good enough to be hired by the CIA in order to fight the war on drugs. Our side of the story is that Noriega got a taste of the money involved in the drug trade, and there's evidence to support that, and went double agent on us. He started telling the cartels our plans and how to subvert them. Their side of the story is that the U.S. government was profiteering in the drug trade, playing both sides of the field and using the Panama Canal to funnel drugs into and out of the area and surrounding countries, and worldwide, making billions of invisible dollars to spend as we pleased without anyone to ask any questions. Who do you believe? That seems to be exclusively dependent on where you were born. If you were born in Panama, you might tend to believe Noriega. If you were born in the U.S., well, there's a high probability that you pledged allegiance to the flag. What's the truth? Somebody certainly knows or knew, but they either already have or shortly will take the truth to the grave with them. There are fascinating stories and accounts from Operation Just Cause. I did extensive research after learning that the game, Just Cause, was designed to sort of tell the story of the conflict. It's really hard for me to pin down one tale and share it, and I certainly don't have enough space here to tell all that I know about it. So what I'll do instead is encourage anyone who's even slightly interested to dig. Just when you think you've learned everything there is to know about it, you'll find a link to something you haven't seen before, a scan you didn't know about, a story that you hadn't heard before. There is such an extraordinary breadth of recording surrounding this conflict. It has been postulated that the reason for that is to muddy the waters, so to speak. It's said that the real story is out there, published, verified, and available for anyone to read, and that in order to combat the possibility of anybody finding out the truth, hundreds and hundreds of fake stories and accounts were published in tandem with them, utilizing the same search terms and keywords to make sure that the genuine truth remains buried under a sea of lies. Story 37. Aaron Burr was a lawyer, one of the founding fathers, fought by all accords honorably in the Revolution, vice president under Jefferson, and was well liked. Hamilton, on the other hand, started a smear campaign against him and provoked a duel, used cheated guns with a hair trigger, and missed. Burr did not miss, and eventually Hamilton died. Everybody thought Hamilton fired over Burr's head as a way to placate him, and no blood be drawn. But in reality, he just jumped the gun. Burr was considered a coward and was driven into obscurity. Story 38. Phineas Barnum. Yes, he wasn't this adorable, perfect guy from The Greatest Showman, but reactions to this movie were over-exaggerating bad moments in his biography. Yes, he exploited freaks, but he allowed them to get profit from their deformities, and General Tom Thumb and the Siam twins were forever thankful to him, and even helped financially after the fire. After 3 months in jail in adolescence, he swore never to break the law, and as far as I'm aware, he did keep this swear. He was an abolitionist, and the fire in 1864, not the one that burned the museum to the ground, but also pretty big, was organized by Confederate sympathizers. Overall, he was an asshole and a godfather of modern mass-manipulating media, but he wasn't as evil as many think. And no, he never said there's a sucker born every minute. Story 39, Julius Caesar. He wasn't all that bad of a guy to his own people. He regularly gave out money to the poor and paid his army well. He was stabbed to death because he threatened the power of certain members of the Senate and held far too many ideas that favored the general populace over the members of the Senate. The dude was also really smart and a good leader in general. I find his death to be tragic. Story 40. Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, the doctor who John W. Booth was acquainted with and who he went to for medical treatment after assassinating Pres Lincoln. The evidence was circumstantial that they were working together. His biggest mistake was not reporting the treatment to the authorities sooner. Booth's boot, engraved with his name, was found at Mudd's residence. He escaped the death penalty by one vote and was sent to life in prison in the Florida Keys. He tried to escape once but later took over as prison doctor and saved many lives from a yellow fever epidemic. Later he was pardoned and resumed his medical practice at home. This was the origin of the phrase of someone's name being Mudd. Story 41. When HIV first came about, a team of researchers worked day and night trying to figure out what was going on, flying around the country to various hotspots to investigate. All they knew was that gay men were getting sick and dying and they wanted to figure it out. They didn't know why. One suspect thing was poppers, which were popular in the gay community. The working name they used was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. So now armchair Redditors point that out with disgust as evidence of them being homophobes and terrible people. They were working their ass off to figure out why gay men were dying, and that's the thanks they get. What would you do? I'm waiting in the comments. Story 42, Antonio Salieri. The movie Amadeus paints Salieri as a jealous composer who how much success Mozart had as contemporaries. But the movie really takes some liberties with their relationship. In fact, all accounts say that they had mutual respect for one another, with Salieri even teaching Mozart's son at a young age. Amadeus is a great movie, but doesn't give enough credit to Salieri's character or his music. Story 43. One figure that comes to mind is Malcolm X. For a long time, he was painted as a villain in mainstream narratives, often characterized as a radical and a threat to the establishment. However, when you dig deeper into his life and the context of his activism, you see a man who is fundamentally about justice, empowerment, and the fight against systemic oppression. Malcolm was raised in an environment riddled with racism and violence, which shaped his worldview. His advocacy for black rights and self-determination challenged the status quo and exposed the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to champion equality while perpetuating inequality. He understood that the struggles of African Americans were not just about civil rights. They were about human rights. His journey from a life of crime to a powerful voice for social change illustrates his complexity. He transformed his understanding of oppression and began to articulate a vision for liberation that resonated with many. The mainstream media often demonized him, but his message of self-respect, empowerment, and solidarity with oppressed people everywhere was revolutionary. In reality, Malcolm X was not a bad guy. He was a man who confronted the harsh realities of his time and dared to challenge the systems that sought to oppress him and his people. It's crucial to recognize that the labels history assigns can be misleading. Sometimes the bad guys are simply those who refuse to conform to the expectations of a society that is too comfortable with injustice. Story 44, Ulysses S. Grant. Just hear me out. Not that he was a bad guy to begin with. However, Southern historians tried to destroy his name. He was a man who loved his men dearly and dedicated his memoir to them. He turned the Union Army into hammer and the South would be the anvil. He rode into battle with his men. He wasn't a raging alcoholic. He only started to drink in private after the Overland Campaign. It broke him down. He was an excellent general and good man. Story 45. Juana of Castile, not a bad guy per se, but doomed to be known as Juana la Loca when she was likely a very capable ruler. She was the last queen of Spain who was wed to Philip of Habsburg. Her husband brutally beat and abused her, and it's likely that most of her 6 children were products of rape. She likely suffered intense PTSD when she was chased and imprisoned multiple times in her marriage, leading to the infamous stories of demanding her husband's coffin to be opened when his body was being transported and laid to rest. After her husband died, her father declared her insane and took the throne while imprisoning Juana in a convent with her youngest daughter. After a few years, her father and son decided to remove her daughter from the convent and left Juana alone with the nuns until her death at age 75. She led a sad, lonely life and doesn't deserve the slander she's always gotten. Not fun fact. Her sister was Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's wife, and she visited once to find her sister imprisoned and impoverished after Catherine's intended husband, Arthur, died shortly after they had wed. The girls in the family had awful, terrible luck. Story 46, Nero. A lot of evidence recovered nowadays have started to disprove a lot of stories told about his rule as fictional, and quite possibly the result of a smear campaign by those in power who were disgusted by his affinity for commoners and progressive ideas culture. In fact, most stories we know about his rule weren't even written until decades after his death. Not to say that means it wasn't factual from that alone, but for the most part, these post-mortem tales are pretty much the only records told for hundreds of years after, sealing his reputation as an insane liar playing dictator who watched his city burn, an event he wasn't even in the city for, but returned afterwards to head a relief effort. Story 47. Queen Mary I of England, she of the namesake cocktail, was actually quite popular in the early part of her reign. Why? Because thanks to her divine right powers, she was able to order the economy of bankrupt England to reinvent itself. Debts were cancelled, the monetary system reformed, and the little people had a chance to make a decent living. Had she been able to successfully produce a child who would have been baptized Catholic, she wouldn't have had to persecute Protestants, including her half-sister Elizabeth. Roman Catholicism would have once again become the state religion, enforced by 2 successive Tudors. But that didn't happen, and Elizabeth and her Protestant faction took over. Story 48. William Shockley. He and his team invented the silicon transistor, hence Silicon Valley, in Palo Alto, California. However, he later started talking about social problems of America. He suggested that if black women in inner cities are not allowed to have children, this would spare many black people, since the chance of a black child growing up in the inner cities either dying of crime or committing fatal crime is so high. Whether his argument is correct or not, I do not know. However, I know that it is a taboo subject in USA. We are not allowed to discuss it. My personal take is, he was thinking like an engineer. But why bother to go into that topic? That I would like to know. Even though Shockley's solid-state transistors are used in today's computers and electronics en masse and made the digital age possible, he has been canceled from history. There are even claims that he did not invent the transistor. His lab on Homer Street in Palo Alto has been razed to the ground, and there are no traces of it left. Instead, the Hewlett-Packard garage, where they used Shockley's transistors to create the calculator, is celebrated as the Silicon Valley birthplace. If you visit the Computer Museum in San Jose, you can see censorship of Shockley in display. From vacuum tubes, we suddenly jump to complex electronic, completely hiding the most important invention that made them possible. Even if Shockley's ideas about social problems of USA are offensive, I do not think it is right to hide him from history. Censorship is always a bad idea. Given that USA prides itself in freedom of speech, the censorship of Shockley is a proof that we are hypocrites at the core and are no different from all the other peoples we so like to criticize. Story 49, Joe Biden. Not only has he been slandered as corrupt based upon insinuations and conspiracy theories and witch hunt investigations that resulted in 0 indictments or impeachment proceedings, but he saved America from a recession that looked inevitable, escaped post-COVID supply chain inflation better than almost any other country in the world, restored our relationships with our allies and stability to the White House, and stood up for attacked allies without involving U.S. troops in new wars. He has been the best president of my lifetime, and I am not even a Democrat. Story 50, Captain Kidd. He actually wasn't a pirate, but had a commission from the king to raid Spanish vessels during wartime. The war ended, but nobody told Captain Kidd, and when he returned to port with all sorts of booty, he was charged with piracy, and somehow his commission disappeared. He was hung as a pirate, but something like 200 and some odd years later, somebody found the actual commission. Story 51. In terms of villainy, Rasputin's basically guilty of possibly being the Tsar's wife. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek there, but he didn't really do that much. Nicholas II wasn't exactly a good man, and the Russian people didn't need much of a push to revolt, especially given how poorly things were going on the Eastern Front during WBY. Yet there we have a late 90s musical making it look like the man was making deals with devils and using witchcraft to incite the proletariat. Poor guy was just out there making outlandish healing claims and showing women in the court his endowment for their endowment, if you get what I mean. Story 52. Anne Boleyn. First and foremost, her being involved with Henry VIII has been wildly sped up in movies and TV shows. He had been with Catherine of Aragon for approx 20 years at that point. He was not a youthful sex machine king media makes him out to be. He was an old adulterer who even had a son with one of his partners. Once that happened, his frustration for a male heir mounted. Honestly, he would have eventually either divorced Catherine or killed her, since she was at an age where children were no longer in the cards. Anne was the only one of his conquests who said no to being a mistress Due to the aftermath her sister Mary suffered after being his mistress. His affair or courtship of Anne lasted 7 years before he was able to marry her. Historical hatred of Anne comes from the Catholic Church, as she was Protestant. Catherine was Catholic and was backed by Spain and Rome. Anne survived several assassinate attempts over the years for that fact. Even in the artwork, you can see in Catholic renditions, she looks witch-like with moles and even an extra finger, but in Protestant paintings she looks normal. During their marriage, Henry had an accident jousting in which he suffered a head injury and was unconscious for 3 days. After that, his mood significantly shifted, many historians on both sides calling him irritable and hot-headed. This event also added stress to Anne, who miscarried a boy, which fueled Henry's anger. It's important to note that most historians agree that Anne was not a submissive wife like what was common at the time. She was intelligent and strong in her opinions, which led to more discourse in the marriage. Henry had head trauma, and she was frustrated with his attitudes shifting. Her not being submissive also ruffled feathers of more traditional noblemen, especially the Catholic lords. And as Catholics, they viewed her sway on Henry as witchcraft and unholy. There was no evidence that she had a sexual relationship with her brother and her father. Although there were witnesses, historians agree that shifting tides at court meant most people weren't loyal and could also be easily threatened. So would you rather side with a queen losing favor or a king that at that point in time had absolute power? Henry also had been pursuing Jane Seymour, who by all accounts was viewed as Anne's replacement. Anne previously picked Henry's sexual partners when she was unavailable. When Jane was a factor, Anne no longer had control. Even her last words are controversial. There were many witnesses and varying accounts of what she said. The official words, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I pray God save the king, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." Some interpret this as her dying words still showing how in love she was with Henry. Others say, since there's not definitive proof she said this, that these words were added to historical accounts by Henry to assuage his guilt and her conviction. We will never know. Her legacy was inspiring the king to break from Catholicism and starting the Church of England, where instead of being beholden to the church, regular citizens could read the Bible themselves and not worry about the financial corruption of the Catholic Church. This was at the time. This event also inspired other nations to break away from being underfoot of Catholic Rome. She also left behind one of the longest ruling monarchs England has seen, Elizabeth I, who stabilized the region militarily and economically after her 2 predecessors failed to fix the country's problems. Henry VII left his children. Story 53, Alistair Denniston, or Commander Alexander Alistair Guthrie Denniston. He was played by Charles Dance in The Imitation Game, the movie about Turing inventing a computer to break Nazi codes. The movie did him dirty, portrayed him as a sort of foil or even villain that must be overcome in order for Turing to do his work. The guy's family saw the movie and were outraged. Story 54, Fritz Haber. Now that is really a controversial one, but hear me out first. In my opinion, this fellow was just really dedicated to his work. He got presented with a problem and worked out a solution. He just lacked the emotional understanding of what he was doing. For those who don't know, Fritz Haber was a chemist, and you can say he was a genius. What did he invent? Well, he has 2 major contributions to his name. For one, he is the father of chemical warfare. His idea to make chemical gas weapons killed millions of people in one of the most inhumane ways possible, an invention that not only made him the poster boy for evil scientists and shunned him in the scientific community. It also was the reason his wife committed suicide, because she couldn't live with a person who made something so horrible. The other invention, on the other hand, is so great that we should actually build statues of him in every country in the world. He invented artificial fertilizer. For those who don't understand, he made modern agriculture possible so that we can feed a lot more people. Without that invention, millions of additional people would starve to death each year, and the population growth of Earth as a total wouldn't have been possible. This invention saved billions of lives over the years and is maybe one of humanity's greatest inventions ever. So was he a bad guy, or was he a good guy? I would say he was neither. He was a man who saw a problem and tried to solve it without thinking of the consequences.